Well, with me in the studio this hour, Danny Ayalon is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Thanks for being with us, Danny. And Benjamin Anthony is the CEO of the Miriam Institute. Great to see you, Benjamin, as well. Thank you for being with us. So, Danny, I'll start with you. The theory is Sinwar does not want a deal. He doesn't want a deal before Ramadan. What he wants is for the IDF to go in full throttle to Rafah at Ramadan. Lots of terrible images going around the world which will force Israel to stop the war. Do you go along with that?
Well, Laura, I'm not sure that there's anyone who can really decipher his intentions, Sinwar's intentions. Also, there is a lot of difficulties of connections, physical connections between him and the other leaders of Hamas who are outside in Qatar or Turkey or wherever. But it seems like there is still some brinkmanship that is played by Hamas, trying to really get as much as they can. And I'm not sure that the Ramadan deadline is really such an important one. I mean, it's an artificial one. Wars in the Muslim world have been started and have been waging during Ramadan. So this is more of a pressure, an outside pressure by the Americans mostly, to bring about a ceasefire, which is very important for the Americans, also for Biden politically. And that would be, from the American point of view, a segue to maybe a larger deal, which would actually bring about some normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and of course, isolating Iran.
Benjamin, what are your thoughts? Do you think there's any chance at all of some kind of agreement in Cairo tonight?
Look, I think it behooves all of us to hold out some optimism for some sort of deal right up to any deadline, whether, as Danny described it rightly so, an artificial one or one that is truly of this earth. But with that having been said, I know that we started this segment talking about what Sinwar wants. I think it's appropriate that we talk about what we want here in Israel. Let's not forget there are two very, very clear aims. The first is to end Hamas's ability to wage war against the state of Israel and to dismantle them as a terror organization, a functioning one. And the second is to bring the hostages home. Now, we just saw the report by the UN about the sexual violence used as a weapon of war on October the 7th, and the note there that we all should be looking at is that there is reason to believe that that is ongoing during captivity and is being used against some of these hostages, something none of us wish to think about. With that in mind, it's a priority to bring these hostages back. It's a priority to end the ability of Hamas to wage war against us, so our citizens can go home to the south in an atmosphere of peace, safety and security. And I personally believe that if hostages are not actually being released by the time Ramadan comes around, not negotiations moving forward, but hostages are actually being released, then we should breeze right through that artificial deadline, as it was just dubbed, and we should move deliberately and forcefully to bring about our war aims.
Okay, Benjamin, for now, thank you. Let's get some reaction to that then, because the families, of course, of the 134 hostages still being held in Gaza have now spent an agonizing 154 days without any news at all about their loved ones. Some of the families and their supporters gathered in Tel Aviv tonight. Balir Sladin is with them, and he joins us now. And Balir, President Biden said that the families could expect some good news last Monday. Of course, it didn't happen. What is the mood down there tonight?
Well, it's really a pessimistic atmosphere here at the hostage square, especially after what we are hearing from the media and from the sources that are knowing what is happening right now in Cairo, because a source from Hamas is telling saying that the talks are on the verge of collapsing after their demands are not being met by the Israelis, and they are still demanding a constant ceasefire and also the return of all of the families that evacuated from the north of the Strip to their homes to the north of Gaza, including aid that will come from Israel toward these areas in the north of Gaza. Of course, these demands are absolutely not going to be accepted by the Israelis, and that's what the source is telling us. But on the other hand, the sources from the Egyptian delegations are are saying that the main point of disagreement right now is the return of mainly the men from the south of Gaza to the north. Israel has agreed that some of the families that have been evacuated from the north come back to their homes, but only the women and their children under the age of 16 or 15, if I'm not mistaken. So all men that are in the age of service that can actually conduct military operations against Israel are the main point of disagreement between the parties right now. Israel, of course, is not willing to accept that because that might eliminate their military achievements in north of Gaza after all, and they are thinking that by doing that they are holding one card against Hamas for this. So what we are saying here is that the atmosphere is pessimistic. We've been also in the protest that hundreds gathered yesterday in front of the American embassy in Tel Aviv, and they're demanding the release of the hostages before Ramadan. That's what they are hoping, especially after President Biden said yesterday that the decision is in the hands of Hamas right now. So he's trying to put pressure more on Hamas, as he's saying that Israel already accepted what have been agreed upon in the Paris summit, the last one. So right now only Hamas can decide whether they want to go with this or decline this proposal.
Balia, thank you very much. Balia Sledin down in central Tel Aviv. With me in the studio, Danny Ayalon and Benjamin Anthony. So Danny, one of the strategies, of course, of Hamas is to get the international pressure on Israel to stop the war. It wants a permanent ceasefire. It wants Israel to withdraw from Gaza. And the aid issue is very much playing into that. There's an awful lot of pressure on Israel to provide more aid. Do you think Israel should take a more hands-on role when it comes to delivering aid to people in Gaza?
Well, certainly the Hamas and even the Americans, they used this fiasco last week where 100 and more Palestinians during a stampede were killed, and that brought the Americans to drop from the air a lot of rations, food rations to them, demanding Israel to bring in more humanitarian and food, and Israel is indeed doing that.
We've got about 100 trucks a day going into Gaza.
Yes,
right now.
which basically is even more than entered Gaza before October 7th. So actually is what Israel is doing, and this is actually from the day one, was the American, let's say, policy was that in order to be able to continue the ground operation, we need to alleviate the humanitarian conditions. So they go hand in hand, although from a pure military stance, this is not helping Israel because it helps Hamas more than it does Israel, but I don't think Israel has a choice. And in order to continue the ground operation, they need to do something with the humanitarian aid.
Okay, Benjamin, do you agree with that?
I agree with much of what Danny said. I'll just make a couple of quick points in with regard to the subject we're speaking about. First of all, the reporter there made mention of Hamas's demand for a permanent ceasefire. Look, there is absolutely no possible notion of a permanent ceasefire with Hamas. I remind everybody that shortly after October the 7th, they were saying out loud and unabashedly that they would repeat the events of October 7th again and again and again if they had the opportunity to do so. These people cannot be brought to a ceasefire. And the second point that I would make is that I think that there's been a little bit of a breaching of the deal between us and the Americans at this stage, because the Americans are those who have pressed for Israel to send aid into the Gaza Strip. We've done that dutifully. People should be aware that airdropping aid is merely a drop in the bucket when compared to the massive amounts that can be brought in and have been brought in by way of our tracks that have passed from Israel into the Gaza Strip. But if Israel is sending in aid in accordance with the expectations of the Americans, then Israel and Israelis should not fall prey to lectures from the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, who expressed that there is a humanitarian catastrophe taking place inside the Gaza Strip. Rather, we should enjoy the military support and the diplomatic support as we continue to hold up our end of the bargain, by the way, in revolt against popular opinion here in Israel. Most Israelis are not for the injection of this massive humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip as long as our hostages remain there.
Okay, all right. Well, there are cracks, Danny, aren't there, beginning to show in the war cabinet between the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, and the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. They all seem to offer different visions of how to proceed, how to maintain those military gains inside Gaza. Just talk us through those varying strategies, and what should Israel be doing more to talk about the day after in Gaza?
Yeah, well, one thing which is unanimous in the war cabinet is that the Hamas battalions in Gaza must be dismantled, as well as all the other 16 or 18 that were dismantled, because otherwise it will really give a springboard for the Hamas to actually retake Gaza. And this is something that Israel cannot accept. As Benjamin said, they have vouched actually and vowed to continue, and if they can, to do more massacres, savages like, on the 7th of October. Another thing is that the issue of the hostages. Here, there is, I would say, a more flexible stance by Gantz and Eisenkot. Gallant here is actually siding with the Prime Minister, with Netanyahu. So it remains to be seen. I think a lot will also depend on the American position. The Americans are also starting to draft a UN Security Council resolutions for a ceasefire, and also calling for bringing back the hostages home. So a lot of things are, a lot of moving parts. So it remains to be seen how things will progress. And again, I'm not sure that this arbitrary deadline of Ramadan will be respected, or whether it's really matters or not.
Okay, for now, thank you very much, both of you. Well, the astonishing wealth of the Hamas leaders who live in Qatar has been well documented, and the IDF has seized millions of dollars in cash that was transferred to the terrorist group from Doha, all with the approval of Israel. More in this report.
Let's see some of the new money that arrived today.
What is it? How much money is there?
So here, as we opened it, we saw that there were 6 packages, each holding $10,000, $60,000 in each plastic bag.
How many such bags are there?
$1.5 million, one bag.
$1.5 million? One bag? It feels a little strange to me to stand next to such a large amount of money.
This is the largest catch that has been so far, and we're talking about the equivalent of 20 million shekels.
You've become a bit of a banker.
We're not bankers, so the money won't stay here. We'll count everything, record it, and it will be out here tonight.
Do you remember the picture of Mohammed Daif with the dollars in his hands?
I remember. It's possible to return it to him.
Busy days for this IDF unit.
In Khan Yunis, IDF forces have raided the local Hamas headquarters in recent days and found millions of shekels, terrorist money that Hamas kept in safes.
This month, we saw the photos of Yahya Sinwar underground in Khan Yunis with a handbag and flip-flops. But when you see what he left behind in the tunnel, you realize that he was forced to flee quickly.
We arrived here at Yahya Sinwar's main hideout. You can see what's here underground. Everything was left here. They ran away. They heard the IDF approaching, heard us approaching. They knew we were coming and ran away. Here's a safe that we broke into and found millions of shekels and dollars inside the safe, and more money that is scattered outside. We understand that he fled from here and left at least some of his millions behind.
About 25 million shekels left Khan Yunis in one day, equivalent to all the money accumulated by the unit since October 7th.
In the building, on this floor, grenades, vests, weapons. Work is now starting to open the safes. We broke into the safes, and inside them, we discovered hundreds of thousands of shekels, hundreds of checks, and we also saw documentation. All this trade was actually done between October 2nd and 5th.
More than 50 million shekels in cash have been seized in the Gaza Strip in total. Blood money intended for terrorism. It's been confiscated by the IDF.
What exactly is booty?
Booty is basically all the property seized during the fighting that we can say is related to terrorism. It starts with money, ammunition, computers. Everything that serves the terrorists is defined as booty.
And in case anyone sees these piles and wonders, there's no way to take it and slip it into your pocket.
And every such catch, their commanders here, their officers. And as soon as we see something, we also document the transfer to them by counting the number of packages on the spot. They receive a notification from us that the responsibility has passed to us, and from that moment, we manage this process until we transfer it, in the case of the money, to the Ministry of Defense, to the Ministry of Defense accountant who signs that he received the amount from us.
The huge sum seized was transferred that same night to the Defense Ministry. From there, it will go through a legal process, be declared criminal booty, and will be confiscated by the state. After all, we remember what the Hamas dollars mean.
Anyone who kidnaps people gets a reward.
What was the reward you were promised?
An apartment, meaning a house, $10,000, because they want prisoners.
What are the gloves actually for? So that the uncleanliness of the Hamas unit doesn't infect you?
No, because here, these weapons are weapons from October the 7th, so some of them have DNA residue. Everything you see here was fired on October the 7th.
And what do you do with most of the weapons you seize, which are not on display?
Weapons are transferred to a military weapons warehouse, and from there, the Ministry of Defense has options for whatever it needs. Whether it's selling to other countries, whether it's scrap, selling for iron.
Yassin?
Al Yassin, right. This is the local launcher that Hamas manufactures. There is the ZPU, the heavy anti-aircraft machine gun. They keep the bullets themselves in buckets, some of which are paint buckets and some of tahini. These rice bags don't actually contain rice, they contain bullets and ammunition. And a hacking frame that is especially for hanging on a fence. There are hooks for hanging it here, with all the central parts here consisting of air conditioner plastic ducts. The trench itself is filled with explosives, TNT. You put an explosive here in front, and the explosion simply blows a hole in the fence, and then you can enter.
The activity is very important. The readiness of the unit to immediately carry out the task, from the moment the booty is seized, to bring it in for investigation, after we check that it's not booby-trapped. We bring it in for investigation within 4 hours from the moment of seizure. We're already with the investigating authorities. It's at record speed so they can get it to the fighting forces in a few hours.
And from the unit that removes the booty to the next stop, the Intelligence and Technical Spoils Collection Unit. Here is an exclusive and rare look at the place where they decipher exactly to whom the seized money belongs.
This morning, I visited the booty collection unit of the Intelligence Corps. This envelope was specially intended for Yahya Sinwar and his family. $20,000 in cash.
$20,000 to Yahya Sinwar, like something personal. I mean, it's $20,000 personally for Sinwar. Does this envelope indicate that we are closing in on Sinwar?
We are actually reaching the underground in Khan Yunis. Inside this underground, we found tens of millions worth of money that was stored there and used by senior Hamas officials. We see that Hamas officials took a lot of money that arrived into the Gaza Strip, kept it for themselves in sacks, took it for personal use, and for building military infrastructure.
So what actually happened this week?
A shipment of materials from the underground in Khan Yunis arrived one evening. All the members of the unit actually jumped, and we basically worked here all night. We stayed here until 4 in the morning because of the urgency.
Did you understand straight away that this was something unusual?
Totally. We realized that was actually a night of lifetime. None of us have experienced anything like this in the service.
And it's critical to exploit the intelligence now.
Critical.
How long does it take to decipher so many things?
So we've been here for 4 months now, spending weekends, Saturdays, nights here. We're actually active here 24/7. It takes a lot of time to decipher all this material and get it out as quickly as possible. I mean, it's not like we can take our time.
On a personal level, how do you feel holding in your hands the envelope that Sinwar himself once held?
Look, beyond the fact that I'm going to wash my hands with soap after this, touching this envelope shows how close we are to the Hamas leadership, and we are actually breathing down their necks. We will continue to pursue them until we get the entire Hamas leadership, until we find our captives. And now, you can see that at least 20,000 of Sinwar's dollars are currently with us, and not with him.
Well, fresh from what was reportedly a very tense meeting with President Biden's top aides in Washington, the War Cabinet member Benny Gantz is now on his way to the UK, where he'll be meeting Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron. Cameron has stepped up calls on Israel to halt its war with Hamas in recent weeks. For more on that, we can go to London and our correspondent Jonathan Sacerdoti. So, Jonathan, what can we expect when Benny Gantz arrives in London later?
Remember that this trip by Benny Gantz is not approved by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, so it's definitely a bit awkward for Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary here, to receive him. And yet he is receiving him. There's even some rumour that he may have a brief meeting with Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. And that's probably because of that Channel 13 poll this week that showed that Gantz, a former Defence Minister and chair of Israel's National Unity Party, is likely to win 39 seats in an election, with Netanyahu only securing 17, and that would mean, of course, that they see him as a potential successor. Of course, he's also in the War Cabinet, so they consider it maybe valid to speak with him. But the Foreign Office here would not talk to me about the meeting at all, said they'd let me know later. Cameron has spoken in the run-up to the trip. He spoke last night in the House of Lords, and he was really very tough in terms of what he said about what he wanted to discuss. He said that Israel, as the occupying power, is responsible for ensuring the delivery of aid in Gaza, and his quote is that we are facing a situation of dreadful suffering in Gaza. There can be no doubt about that. He said, I spoke some weeks ago about the danger of this tipping into famine and the danger of illness tipping into disease, and we're now at that point. People are dying of hunger, he said. People are dying of otherwise preventable diseases. So you can imagine that these will all be among the messages that he sends to Mr. Gantz to take back to Israel. And he's been saying for some time that he thinks that Israel isn't doing enough in terms of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and also that he wants Britain to start a process of recognition of a Palestinian state, though he's somewhat backtracked on that, saying it's not for immediately, but it doesn't need to wait until sort of final status solution between the parties.
And Jonathan, the war between Israel and Hamas has become a dominant issue in British politics, hasn't it? There was a lot of alarm last week when virulently anti-Zionist MP George Galloway got into Parliament.
Yes, indeed it has, and it's a bit of a mystery, really, because I think that in real terms, a lot of what we're seeing here in the UK isn't necessarily to do about Gaza, even though it says it is. I think that Gaza and Palestinians has become a bit of a rallying cry for certain parts of British society and the British electorate, and Galloway and others are capitalising on that. Of course, they say that their concern is for the people of Gaza, but many people will point towards some of the protests and some of the messages coming out from those, and again from some politicians, saying that really it's almost pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, not necessarily anything geared towards some kind of solution, anything to better the situation of the Palestinians themselves. Even those votes in Parliament that went so horribly wrong not that long ago were non-binding votes. They wouldn't change Britain's position on a ceasefire or any other matter to do with support for Israel's war in Gaza. And so I think in many ways it's reflective of a change going on in British society and divisions here within the domestic society, as much as it is a reflection of people's horror of what they're seeing on their TV screens coming out of Gaza and their actual opinions on the situation there. But make no mistake, politicians and many in Britain are in fact hardening their determination to see Israel have a ceasefire, pause its actions, and to see more aid going into Gaza.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Jonathan Sacerdoti in London. Time for a break. When we come back, we'll head to the north. The day after Hezbollah fired dozens of rockets at northern Israel.
Israel is in a state of war.
Families completely gunned down in their beds. We have no idea where is she.
As our soldiers are fighting on the front line, but the general perception is something that certainly needs to be fought as well.
must reach the whole world. The I-24 News Channel, broadcasting from Israel, with dozens of correspondents throughout the world, brings the truth from Israel to hundreds of millions of people in scores of countries.
Completely gunned down in their beds.
De la frontière qui sépare Israël.
The state of emergency and war in Israel.
Bringing Israel's story to the world. I-24 News Channels. Now on Hot.
Welcome back. Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister says indirect talks with Israel will begin during the month of Ramadan, provided there is a ceasefire in Gaza. Najib Mikati spoke a day after the Iranian-backed terrorist group Hezbollah fired dozens of rockets at towns in northern Israel. No casualties were reported. Let's get the latest from northern Israel now with our correspondent Robert Swift. And Rob, what's happening a day after that heavy barrage on northern Israel?
So attacks have continued, not at the pace that we saw yesterday, but as is usually has been usual since the start of the war, there has been at least some attacks. In the last 3-4 hours, Hezbollah has claimed responsibility for 2 attacks. One of these was a drone infiltration towards the community of Matula, and the second was what it says, we have no confirmation yet, but it claims as an anti-tank weapon attack in the far northeast of Israel's northern border. Now, with regards to the first of these, the drone infiltration, the IDF has said that it intercepted that drone, although there were no drone warning sirens sounding at the time, as is usually the case, possibly due to the drone flying low. At this stage, it's not clear why there was no signal then. And the IDF has also said that it responded to the infiltration by striking targets inside southern Lebanon.
And Rob, what about those comments by Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister? This, of course, follows a visit to the region by the US envoy Amos Hochstein. What can we read into Mikati's comments?
Yeah, it does seem like there's a possible ray of hope here for those looking for some sort of compromise on the northern border. It does seem like Hochstein, his efforts may have at least landed partially home. Politicians close to Hezbollah are understood to be studying some of Hochstein's comments, his proposals. Essentially, some form of deal that would see Hezbollah removing its forces from the south of Lebanon and the Lebanese army stepping in there to take over. Now, from an Israeli perspective, it can be assumed that Israel won't get all this for free, that it will have to make some sort of compromise, and at the minute it waits to be seen what this is.
All right, Rob, thanks very much. Rob Swift there in the north of Israel. Well, a reminder, with me in the studio this hour, Benjamin Anthony is the CEO of the Miriam Institute, and Danny Ayalon is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Benjamin, are we inevitably heading towards all-out war with Hezbollah? It's a question I've asked before, but Amos Hochstein has just kind of made his best effort. We're hearing from the very weak Lebanese government, but when it comes down to it, how do you see this playing out?
Amos Hochstein's best effort is not even nearly close enough to what is required to allow our citizens to return home in a sense of safety and security. The fact of the matter is that there's this art of what's called misdirection during war. So, for example, from the Israeli perspective, when the world is watching our events and our activities in Gaza, it gives us usually the opportunity to operate with greater intensity in Judea and Samaria. But also, I think that we're suffering from that as Israelis, or we're falling for that trick as Israelis, because as we are watching ourselves what's going on in Gaza, we're not looking with sufficient intensity about the fealty of our activities in northern Israel. Look, the numbers are pretty striking. They have fired 30 rockets on Kiryat Shmona yesterday, 10 were intercepted. That is indicative of the idea that the Iron Dome won't be able to stand fast, as we know, in the face of a serious barrage from southern Lebanon at the hands of Hezbollah. In addition to that, we've lost 10 soldiers, we've lost 7 civilians, and while the chief of staff here in Israel is saying that Hezbollah is already paying a heavy price, since this began, with 80,000 of our civilians evacuated, basically refugees in their own country, 233 enemy combatants have been killed when it comes to Hezbollah. That's not a heavy price, I'm sorry to say. That's not with sufficient force. And I think we need to learn the lesson of October 7th and realize a few things. First of all, the idea of a diplomatic solution is nonsense. There's already a diplomatic solution on the table. That's Resolution 1701. It's been broken, it'll be broken again. And we should also know that our enemies are not deterred, and the best thing that we can do is move in, as I said earlier, a very determined fashion at a time of our choosing and at a time of our initiation. That would be sensible for us to take as a lesson learned from October the 7th. And I said at the beginning of the war, and so I say it again, we should probably have moved against Hezbollah even in advance of a ground maneuver inside the Gaza Strip.
Okay, Benjamin, thank you. Let's leave Hezbollah aside. A pretty grim outlook for the North, because I want to talk about American politics, Danny, former Israeli ambassador to the United States. It is Super Tuesday today, and the Republican Nikki Haley, very staunch ally of Israel, has dropped out of the race. How do you see things playing out over the next few months as Americans' attention move towards the election?
Well, although it seems that Trump is the nominee, is a shoo-in, but we have to pay attention to the nuanced message from Haley. She didn't say she's dropping altogether, but suspending her campaign, I guess, waiting to see, waiting in the wings to see whether Trump may be disqualified due to his legal, trials, which one of them is going to take place at the end of this month. In case he will be disqualified, then she will pick up the nomination very easily, although it's highly unlikely, because even he's will be convicted. There is no doubt that he will also he will appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. So right now it seems like we're going to have a repeat of the 2020 election race between head-to-head between Biden and Trump.
Yep, looks like a rematch, doesn't it? And Benjamin, how will this impact Israel then? Do you think Israel will become more of an issue in the United States, or do you think the country will become more inward-looking?
It's a very interesting point, because there are voters who have voted and committed in North Carolina, about 12.5% of them. Minnesota, Massachusetts, about 9%, and Tennessee, again, about 8%. And that is thought of as a protest against President Joe Biden. The reality of the matter is, though, when you think about Donald Trump's policies with regard to the State of Israel during his tenure, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and so on, the ratification of the Abraham Accords, I think that those who are speaking out against Joe Biden will be very hard-pressed later on to vote in favor of his opponent in the event that that is Donald Trump. I think it's very likely that it will be Donald Trump. And I think also there's been an interesting moment where you've seen the Supreme Court rule against the notion that Trump can be stripped of his candidacy in certain states. I think that's very sensible, because the people, the voters, are not fools. Many people in the media and intelligentsia and so forth would like to believe they are. They're not foolish. The people will vote who they will vote for, and I think that it's very positive that they will have the chance to decide who the president will be, not the courts.
All right, Benjamin, thank you very much. All right, let's move on then to Turkey, because President Erdogan, who has repeatedly accused Israel of war crimes and genocide in its war against Hamas, has vowed to permanently end Kurdish guerrillas by the summer. Erdogan has outlined plans for an imminent military campaign against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, in Iraqi Kurdistan. Turkey's also fighting Kurdish groups in northern Syria. And last week, Human Rights Watch said Turkey had committed possible war crimes against Kurdish citizens in the region. Well, for more on that, we're joined by Giran Ozkan, Executive Director at the Kurdish Peace Institute. Giran, thank you very much for being with us. What do we know about Turkey's plans for Iraqi Kurdistan, first of all?
Well, Erdogan has again continued with his threats to invade further, because he's already there. The Turkish military is already present both in Syria and in Iraq, and quite deep into both countries. So this is no new threat, but we are used to Erdogan making these threats and outlandish claims before elections. And on March 31st, we have another fateful election in Turkey. It's a local election, but cities such as Istanbul and Ankara, Turkey's two biggest cities, are currently being governed by the opposition party, and Erdogan is adamant on winning these cities back. So the ratcheting up of nationalist discourse and Erdogan's claims to crush the PKK by the summer are no new claims. He has said it before. His ministers have said have made similar claims before, that the PKK was on the brink of collapse at any moment. So these are no new threats, but Erdogan ratcheting up the claims that he's making against the Kurds and the PKK before the run-up to the March 31st election is a ploy to once again polarize the country, but in the meantime pushing away all Kurdish voters.
And of course, Giran, President Erdogan has been very vocal in his criticism of Israel and in his embrace of Hamas. And yesterday he welcomed the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to Ankara. To what extent do you think is the war between Israel and Hamas providing cover for Turkey's actions in Syria and elsewhere?
Well, I'm not quite sure it provides cover, because Erdogan has waged this war against the Kurds since he's been in power. The Turkish state has conducted this war against the Kurds since its inception. So the war in Gaza, the war between Israel and Hamas, might be providing Erdogan certain excuses to intervene in the countries in the region. So these, the developments in the Middle East, by and large, have provided Erdogan the excuses to be able to go into countries like Libya, countries like Syria and Iraq, and all the way even into Nagorno-Karabakh in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So Erdogan has been provided with a lot of contextual reasons to be able to intervene and invade these countries. And his main priority, however, in doing all of this is to crush any sort of Kurdish articulation or expression of political existence, whether this occurs in Syria, in Iraq, and he is already doing it in his own country.
And what has been the response from the Kurdish population? I mean, are people leaving? Do they see a future in the region? How are they responding?
Well, I'm sure many of your viewers have heard about Human Rights Watch's most recent report on Turkey's crimes against humanity in Syria. Prior to the most recent report that was issued last Thursday, generally human rights organizations have blamed Turkey's proxies, groups that Turkey supports in Syria. However, this report went one step further and said that the Turkish army itself and the Turkish state was responsible for crimes that they were committing against Kurdish citizens. So what the Kurds are doing, well, they are very used to defending themselves because they had to do it against ISIS first and foremost. This is how the Kurds established themselves in northern Syria. They fought against ISIS, and very bravely, essentially leading to the territorial defeat of ISIS and saving the world from a very inhumane threat actor. However, now the Turkish government, who was largely inactive in the fight against ISIS, actually provided a lot of indirect support to the group, is now seeing the Kurds as a threat and, unfortunately, pressuring and suppressing a Kurdish political articulation in Syria and conducting possible war crimes while doing it.
Giran, thank you very much. Giran Özkan there. Danny Ayalon, Benjamin Anthony with me in the studio. And Danny, let's talk about Israel's relationship with Turkey, which of course was looking much better prior to October 7th. Since then, Erdogan has gone out of his way to criticize and demonize Israel.
Yes, Laura, of course, Erdogan is in no position to criticize Israel, for that matter, anyone, on war crimes, since he is a major perpetrator of war crimes and indeed crimes against humanity. He has always been very instrumental in his relationship with Israel, using it as a, I would say, as a whipping boy. When our elections taking place over there in Turkey, we have to remember that as the leader of the AKP, which is basically the Muslim Brotherhoods of Turkey. He is embracing Hamas. There's no difference between Erdogan and Sinwar in the sense of their ideological belief or religion practice. So for that, he is vehemently against Israel. But at the same time, he is trying to be very instrumental in when he needs Israeli money from tourism, when he needs Israeli gas, natural gas in our economic waters, and his rapprochement or his charm offensive before October 7th was indeed to get Israel to send its gas to the northern parts of Europe through Turkey and not through Cyprus and Greece. But I don't think this will be the case anymore. He cannot be trusted. But interestingly enough, the economic relations continue to go on unabated.
Yeah, that's right, isn't it? There is a strong economic partnership between Israel and Turkey. Are you concerned about Erdogan's increasingly hostile stance towards Israel?
No, I'm not concerned about it because I don't think that there's any change in his form. This is an unmasked, double-dyed, unrepentant, old-fashioned anti-Semite and hater of the Jewish people. I don't think that it's sensible to bank on any notion of stable relations with Turkey. In fact, Ambassador Danny Ayalon has a bit of a legendary story going back a few years with the Turkish emissary to the State of Israel. If it was a longer segment, I'm sure he'd be happy to share that with you. But he gave them a good dressing down once, and I think that everybody should recognize what Erdogan is, what he's not. And I'll tell you something else that bothers me tremendously. This completely absurd, ridiculous notion that the Palestinian Authority, with whom Erdogan has just met, is in some way, shape or form ready, willing, able, qualified or deserving of administering an independent Palestinian state. That nonsense has to be completely dismissed for what it is. Complete drivel and has absolutely no basis in serious discussions about the future of this region.
All right, Benjamin Anthony and Ambassador Danny Ayalon, thank you very much to you both.
Thank you.